Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Florida Realtors 2021 Florida Realtors Florida Bar Contract Updates. My name is Margie Grant, and I'm your Chief Executive Officer of Florida Realtors. I am so excited to be alongside 5 extremely amazing leaders who are here to greet you this morning. Please join me in welcoming your Florida Realtors leadership team. That is President Cheryl Lambert from Citrus County, President-elect Christina Pappas from Miami, Vice President Mike McGraw from the Greater Orlando area, Treasurer Gia Arvin from all the way up in Gainesville, and last but certainly not least, our Secretary Tim Weishire from Osceola County. Ladies and gentlemen, these amazing leaders are the ones that spearhead everything that goes into our legal resources here at Florida Realtors. They work literally 7 days a week to make sure that the association is providing the products, tools, and services to help you make living and have a better business. I will share with you that one of our most popular products is our legal services, specifically our forms library. And today we are so excited to present the 2021 contract changes. I'm going to pause and ask our president if she'd like to unmute and just greet the group.
Sure. Good morning. I would like to thank everyone for participating this morning. I know it's a little early, but that's okay. And this is a big group that we've got coming in, and we're really excited with the momentum and the participation of our members. And I'm very proud of our legal team and the committee that put these form changes together and has spent tremendous amount of hours for you all to have a better business and a better day. So back to you, Margie.
Thank you so much, President Cheryl. So before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I want to go ahead and do a couple updates. As you all know, as you logged in, this webinar is being recorded in webinar format. You will not be on camera and you will not have access to audio. We will post the recording online shortly following this program. We will also post the PowerPoint that will be presented. The contracts, as well as a summary of the changes, have been posted online for your review, and we will put a link to those in the chat if you have not already seen it. Now, to any of my managers, brokers, or any other office leads on the call that are saying, what about the financing provision? That's always the most common question. We need more information about that. We will hold a separate legal webinar on just that section. So they will go over those changes today, but we will hold a separate webinar on just that section. So you'll be able to present office meetings and things like that. So never fear. And then finally, as we conclude today, you may go back to your offices, go to a listing, go show a buyer a property and say to yourself, I have no idea what they meant when they said that specific thing. Not a problem. That is why we have a legal hotline. Every single member of Florida Realtors has access to a legal hotline, opens at 9 a.m., closes at 4:45 p.m. every day. If it's not an urgent question, feel free to leave a message. We'll call you back. But that being said, we want to make sure you know that there are tools available to you to help you get through this process. I am the biggest proponent of I hate change. I hate change. But with all challenge comes opportunity, and the changes that have been incorporated into this contract will protect you, it will protect your consumer, and it will protect the industry. So without further ado, let's meet our panel. So I am so excited to present to all of you 3 of the most brightest attorneys in the state of Florida, all 3 of whom I consider dear friends. So please welcome with me attorney, senior counsel Carol McKee with Florida Realtors. Carol is a senior counsel on our legal team, and she is also our longest tenured hotline attorney. So Carol is sometimes what you call the jack of all trades. If she doesn't know the question, she knows someone who knows the answer. So welcome, Carol. I am also so excited to introduce our longest serving attorney, and that is Deputy General Counsel Marcia Tabak. Marcia Tabak has been with the association for almost 30 years. In her tenure, she has been our sole liaison to the Florida Bar with regard to this contract. And to be totally candid, her efforts are what made this contract here today. She is the one who has coordinated with our volunteers for the last 25 years to make sure that all of the realtor input gets into the contract, because that is the beauty of this product. It is a collaboration between a partnership between the Florida Bar and the Florida Realtors. And it was always essential to make sure that we had practitioner input into the content of this contract. So Marcia, thank you so much for all you do. And finally, our general, our General Counsel, Ms. Joanna Watkins. Joanna serves as the Vice President of Law and Policy and heads up all things legal. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to her, and I'm going to welcome three of the most incredible attorneys in the state. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and say goodbye to our leadership team. They wanted to be on with you here today just to say hello, but they'll go ahead and drop off along with me. Again, if you'll use the chat function for your Q&A, or the Q&A, we'll be monitoring that, and we will post the webinar following the program. Thank you so much for joining all of us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Margie, for that incredible introduction. And I want to reiterate exactly what she said about the leadership team and their support for the law and policy section and for the efforts at bringing programs just like this to our members. They have been incredible in making sure that we are well-resourced, well-staffed to bring you the products and services and tools that you need to be able to be successful in your business. So I want to thank Margie, and I want to thank this leadership team for their unwavering support as we put together 3 years worth of changes in this webinar. Without further ado, I would like to hand this off to Marcia Tabak, who is the Florida Realtors liaison to the Florida Bar, and who is the staff liaison to the Florida Realtors Florida Bar Subcommittee, or excuse me, Realtor Attorney Committee. And she is going to give you some incredible insight into the 3 years worth of changes that culminated into the red line version of the contract that you have available to you today. Marcia, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to share the screen. Good morning, everybody. I am delighted that so many of you joining us today, because this document, together with your efforts of matching buyers and sellers to property, gets transactions flowing in Florida. We have a lot to do today, but I hope to make it simple and clear. Okay, so that's our goal, and I'm going to be your guide, and I'm simply going to walk you through the significant changes in the contract. First, I want to make sure that you all have this URL that you can simply copy and put in your browser, and it will take you to a page on floridarealtors.org, okay? And then once you insert your password and your username, you are going to get to the page where the new revisions and documents reside. You will see the black line forms of the contract. Those are the ones without markup. They are marked draft, but they are going to appear just as the new forms will appear. Along with the black lines, you're going to find the red lines. And the red lines are the ones that show all the deletions and additions. Additionally, you will find the summaries of the changes, and that is true for all of the documents. Tools still to come. The talking contract is in the works, and that's something that we did the last time we revised the form, and it was wildly popular on the website. So that is something communications is working. We've already given them the dialogue, and you should see that probably on this page as well in the future. And as Margie told you, you will also find these PowerPoint slides and a recording of the webinar should you need to refresh. My suggestion is for you all to get a copy of the black lines of the as-is contract, okay? And if you have it next to you while I am reviewing the changes, along with looking, if possible, at the PowerPoint slide, we're going to familiarize you with the major changes. On the screen in front of you, is a list of the documents on the page. It includes the as-is contract, the residential contract, 7 revised riders, and 3 brand new riders. I believe we've mentioned to you that all of these forms will replace the current versions as of November 1st of 2021, okay? So you've got about 5 more weeks to peruse these things, to have your office meetings, to get everybody up to speed on the changes. The first thing I do want to point out to you is that with all Florida Realtor forms, there is a revision date and a form number. These documents will have the revision date of October 2021. And the current forms are, say, the Florida Realtor Florida Bar -5, the as-is -5. They're all converting to 6s. So these, the form numbers and the revision dates are contained on the footers of the documents. So as of November 1st, when you receive an offer or a counteroffer, look at the bottom of the document, and if you see that it's a form of a 6, the as-is or the Florida Realtor Florida Bar 6, you know you're dealing with the most current document. The same is true with the comprehensive riders. They're going to go from the CR5s to the CR6s. So before we get started, I really wanted to talk to you a little bit about background of the contract. As Margie alluded to, as Joanna alluded to, this is a joint product between Florida Realtors and the Florida Bar. And in some form or another, the document has been around for about 50 years now. The secret to its longevity is the fact that it is continually reviewed and continually updated. So I too understand that this isn't easy for you all, but this is bread and butter stuff. The form works because we keep it current, we keep it practical, and frankly, the group that does this is the statewide Joint Realtor Attorney Committee. And their goal is always to create a fair and balanced agreement between the parties. So I know it's painful, but we got to do it. As Margie mentioned, because there's so many of you, I don't know how many are on now, but there's so many of you, we're unable to have a dialogue going other than in the chat box. Some of you did input questions as you registered, and what I'm going to do is try to work some of that information into the program as we progress. So it's my goal, we have up to an hour and a half to do this. I think it's probably going to take us maybe an hour and 10 minutes. We may do some Q&A between Joanna and Carol based upon questions that have come in. We'll see, because this is the first time we've done this. Last thing, I wanted to tell you the way I've analyzed the changes are that some of the revisions are what, in my mind, are simply clarifications of what the contract said and meant, okay? And some of them are really changes. Because I noticed when I looked through the questions that you all inserted when you registered, a number of you said, tell me the biggest changes. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to say, this is something you've got to pay attention to because it's brand new and has impact. But other changes, I'm not saying don't pay attention to them, but I'm saying they're really clarifications and they're not going to present that much of a change to you. Okay. Without further ado, recognize that I'm simply going to identify significant changes. I'm going to display for you a very simplified form of the red line on the screen, and then I'm going to explain the rationale. And together with all of those pieces, I think what the committee has done is going to resonate. Okay. We're going to start with the first change, which is on paragraph 1. It's 1D, personal property. Now, this is the paragraph which has a pre-printed list of personal property, which, if owned by the seller and on the property on the date of the initial offer, will be conveyed to the buyer at close. There were several new items that have been added. And those are in red on the screen. Thermostats and doorbells, television wall mounts and television mounting hardware, mailbox keys, and storm protection items and hardware. Okay, those are new. There was one deletion, and that was the intercom. Why did the committee do this? The thermostats and doorbells relate to the smart home devices. The television wall mounts and television mounting hardware obviously relate to the popularity of securing a TV to the wall and the nuisance it causes when you remove those things from the wall. So a tip from our office is, if you would, when you're taking a listing, simply go through the pre-printed personal property items with the seller when you take the listing. So you will know up front if there's anything on this list that the seller wants to take with them. Because if they do, you can make a note to yourself and make sure when an offer comes in, you can add those items as deleted items in paragraph 1E. Alternatively, you can also make that disclosure on the real property disclosure so people know, nope, seller's taking the chandelier, don't get attached. One question we did get on the change had to do with the sound bar, and somebody explained that a sound bar had been separately secured to a wall sort of adjacent to a television wall mount and television mounting hardware. And so the question was, well, what about the sound bar? And it was funny because we were talking about this in our office, and one of the attorneys said, well, her husband would, probably get a shotgun out if somebody tried to take a sound bar. He said they're really important to people in some instances and can be very expensive. Well, you don't see sound bar on here, okay? So knowing that that could be a very important item, I would automatically list it as an item excluded rather than get into a situation where we have to fight about it. Now, as I told you, I was going to mark things that I think are particularly important, okay? This is kind of small potatoes, but it's particularly important to me, and here's why. This is the kind of stuff people argue about. You might have somebody do a throwdown and not want to close if they can't take their thermostat and doorbell with them. So we want you to be aware of it. I want you to star this because very often we hear from you guys that this is the kind of stuff realtors, end up paying for. So this is going on the star list. Moving on. The next change is contained in paragraph 4. Now, this is a change, when I said some of them are starred and some of them are just sort of helpful clarifications. This falls into what I call a helpful clarification, all right? This is the paragraph that you have been using all along, which said the closing it will occur when the closing agent is furnished the documents on the date y'all insert in the closing date blank. Okay, that's what it's been for quite some time. But many of you know that within paragraph 18 in the standards, there are other relevant provisions that tie into what amounts to a closing. And that would be standard I, which has the closing documents and the procedure and the requirement that the closing agent collect all funds, as well as standard S, which defines really what collecting all the funds means. So the committee, in thinking about this revision this time, decided to import some of this language into paragraph 4 so it would be all together. So now you will find within paragraph 4 a new sentence, and that sentence reads, the closing of this transaction shall occur when all funds required for closing are received by closing agent and collected pursuant to standard S, and all closing documents required to be furnished by each party are received. So this is one location for both buyer and seller to see the closing requires all the funds to be paid and all the documents to be received. And again, the funds need to be received and collected by the closing agent. And the word collected is defined in standard S as actually deposited finally into the closing agent's account. Now, practice tip, and this is something that comes up on the phone, fairly frequently. This contract requires those funds from the buyer to be received and collected by the closing agent, not the seller. So the call that we get from time to time is that we get into tussle sometime with the seller who has not actually received the funds, not wanting the buyer to get the keys. Again, we hope this clarification will be clear. The closing occurs when those funds are collected by the closing agent. Very good. Okay, so that's a clarification. Moving on. Next paragraph I want to mention to you is paragraph 5A, extension of closing date. And that appears on lines 56 through 59. Now, this is a paragraph, again, that in my mind was clarified. This paragraph came into existence maybe around 2013, 2014, something like that, when the CFPB started regulating lenders, okay? And at that point, the closing agent stopped using the HUD-1 and converted instead to a settlement statement called the closing disclosure. Now, so the contract contained language that said, if the buyer's offer was contingent on financing, but the CFPB delivery requirements of the CD were not met, there would be an extension of the closing date up to 10 days. What happened, or what we heard from you all that happened, were that anytime a lender got behind, the arguments were made by the buyers that they were entitled to an automatic extension up to that 10 days because the CD hadn't been delivered. Now, that was never the intent of this clause. So in order to, right the boat here, the committee added some language to clarify what was always meant. So now what the language of 5A says is, if the contract is contingent upon financing, that's paragraph 8B is checked, and the loan has been obtained, and the lender's finished underwriting the loan, but you don't have delivery of the CD in accordance with the requirements of the CFPB, then you can have an extension up to, it's no longer 10 days, it's now 7 days on top of the closing date. So we hope, again, this is a clarification, this was what was intended, but because of what we heard from you all, we added some language to make that clearer. My tip for you, just for those that are curious, the CFPB requirement is that the CD needs to be delivered 3 business days, and you're going to like this, before loan consummation. And, you might be familiar with that term in a different context, consummation, but what the CFPB rule means is that the buyer actually becomes obligated on the loan. Okay, let's move on to paragraph 6. Paragraph 6 is the paragraph in the contract that deals with occupancy and possession. And what I want to do is just focus briefly on paragraph 6B, which if you look at line 72 through 76, if you're following, this is where we're looking. So 6B is to be checked when the seller has leased the property and occupancy will be after close, or the seller intends to do so. So this is the box you need to check. Because of the prevalence of seasonal rentals in Florida and short-term vacation rentals, language has been added to clarify that you are to check box 6B if those occupancies, that is the seasonal rentals or short-term rentals, are to take place after the closing occurs. This was again a clarification in my mind more than a change, The only other change in 6B, I believe, is that with regard to providing estoppel letters right before closing, sellers do not have to do that with regard to seasonal rentals and short-term vacation rentals. All right, that takes us to paragraph 7, assignability. This, of course, is the paragraph that allows the parties to negotiate whether the buyer is going to assign the contract. What is new here is the very last sentence of paragraph 7. This is on line number 85. The contract now reads, if no box is checked, then buyer may not assign this contract. So that is brand new. And by the way, significant, okay? It's significant if you're not checking a box, okay? So if you're representing a buyer, you really should be sure that you're talking to the buyer about whether he wants to be able to sign this or not. And if there is no box checked, the contract will no longer be assignable. And the reason I say it's significant is because without this default, in general, under Florida law, the contract would have been assignable. So it's a change, and it's noteworthy. This moves us to paragraph 8. And let's first talk a little bit about paragraph 8A. 8A is the paragraph and the box that would be checked if the buyer was going to pay cash for the property. So this paragraph used to contain additional language, and the language was something to the effect of if the buyer ended up getting financing, any lender requirements were not going to impact the buyer's requirement to close as cash. After some discussion back and forth, the committee decided, because you're checking this box when the buyer's paying cash, that language was unnecessary, so it's been deleted. Now let's read what the line number 88 does say. A, this is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. So this is still the box you're going to check when it's cash. And the question that you all have asked is, does that mean the buyer cannot get a loan? Well, I just read it. It says this is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. It doesn't mean that the buyer can't get financing. It just means that the offer is not contingent upon that loan being approved. Okay. So this moves us to 8B. So ding, 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 red flags, red flags. This is another one of the paragraphs that contains significant changes. All right. So what the committee talked about for several years with regard to this clause was the fact that they wanted to change the approach with regard to financing and appraisals of the property. Okay, so essentially what they did and what they wanted to do is they wanted to require the appraisal of the property to be obtained by the lender earlier in the process than closing. So in that vein, changes were made to this paragraph, including tasks to be accomplished during loan approval period, components of loan approval, and appraisals would include valuations. So those three things, and I'm going to talk about them in depth. I just wanted to give you an overview. Those three things all relate to the committee's desire to get an appraisal into the hands of the lender within loan approval period as part of loan approval, as opposed to at the end of the transaction near the closing. In addition, there were some changes to notices that can be delivered under this paragraph, and there's an addition to this paragraph that allows the seller to access information about property-related conditions of a buyer's loan approval. So we're going to take this step by step. Okay, starting with line number 89 through 96, at the very beginning of paragraph 8B. This is the clause that you were used to seeing where you would insert the number of days a buyer had to obtain his loan within loan approval period. If you didn't insert an amount, the default was 30 days, and actually the default has remained the same 30 days. And what this clause said was it allowed the buyer to describe the type of loan the buyer was seeking, whether it was conventional, FHA, VA, what the cap on the interest rate they could tolerate, and the term of the loan. So that portion has remained, okay? That is the same. But what is new is what is highlighted after the number 2 on the PowerPoint slide. And that is, in addition to the buyer obtaining approval for the financing described, the buyer's lender is also supposed to receive the appraisal or alternative evaluation of the property within the same loan approval period. So this is the first place you see the committee making this significant change. So what has to be accomplished within loan approval period? Financing has to be approved, and the lender must receive an acceptable appraisal, all within the loan approval period. Now, we did receive a question or two about what you should be considering when you're filling in the blank, okay? And so my thoughts at the moment are, most of you obviously pre-qualify your buyer. The buyer knows what lender they're going to use. It really would behoove you to have a conversation with that lender regarding how many days they're going to need to get this appraisal. Because again, it needs to be obtained within loan approval period. So that to me is your best mechanism for getting an accurate date as to when the buyer can get approved for the loan and the lender can get the satisfactory appraisal. So now we're going to move on. We're going to take our next step to 8. Well, hold on, not taking our next step. I forgot. I wanted to talk to you about line 94 in that paragraph. And that line, let's go back and look at it. That line talks about buyer's mortgage broker or lender having received an appraisal or an alternative evaluation of the property. That is new to the contract. Ding, ding, ding. It's important, okay? It's important because not only does the lender have to receive a full-blown appraisal, but if the lender doesn't require a full-blown appraisal but requires an evaluation or valuation, then that is what has to be received within the loan approval period. Now, why was this done? Because lenders are really changing their practices, obviously. Some of them don't require appraisals. Some of them are requiring products that are not appraisals, but are some other type of valuation. So that's important for you to be aware of. Now we're going to move to the next subsection of paragraph 8, and that's 8BI, which contains the definition of loan approval. Before, under the current contract, the definition of loan approval was the buyer would obtain approval for financing as described in the contract, okay? We've added a new component now, all right? And so that new component is the same one we just discussed. That is, the buyer needs to be approved for the financing, and the lender needs to have received their satisfactory appraisal within the period of time to obtain loan approval. So a buyer should not say they got loan approval if they get an approval from a lender which still says it's dependent upon an appraisal, because this is no longer meeting the definition of loan approval. Loan approval, again, now is going to be two components: financing approved and satisfactory appraisal received by lender. So it was in this way the committee is attempting to move forward the receipt of the appraisal. And why is this being done? Because when you have problems with an appraisal, sometimes you can resolve them, sometimes you cannot. But the committee's thought was, let's try to resolve them earlier. And if they can't be resolved, then the contract is going to terminate and we can put the property back on the market. Okay. The other piece that I want you to be aware of in 8BI has to do with the last sentence that I've got up here on the slide, which is 98 through 101. The contract used to say loan approval, which requires a buyer to sell another property, is not loan approval. Well, it still says that, except there's a proviso. So the proviso is loan approval, which requires a buyer to sell other real property, is loan approval if rider V is attached, okay? And rider V is the rider that the buyer can use to inform the seller that he is going to sell another property and his offer is contingent upon him doing so. Okay. Now we've moved on to paragraph 8BII. This is the paragraph that, and I'm looking at, by the way, lines 106 through 108 and line 110. This is the paragraph wherein the buyer is required to keep the seller fully informed about the status of his loan application, loan processing, appraisal, and loan approval. So the first thing I want you to recognize is that in addition to those things, there is a new element in this paragraph, subsection 8BII, and that is the buyer is also, as of November 1st, when we unveil these new contracts, also needs to keep the seller apprised of property-related conditions of the loan approval, all right? That's a significant change because previously the seller really didn't have a way to become informed of the property-related conditions unless the buyer just told them, okay? So here, that is significant, and let me just add to the significance. Now, the clause requires the seller to request this information from the buyer in writing in order to obligate the buyer to provide this information. Excuse me. Okay. Now we're going to move on to paragraph 8B. III. This is the paragraph that you are accustomed to, which specifies that when the buyer obtains the loan approval, the buyer has an obligation to inform the seller in writing that he got the loan approval. That part's the same. What is new is the second portion of this clause, and again, I'm sorry, I'm on line number 111 through 114. And this second portion is new, so I'm ringing the bell and putting the red flag here because I want you to be aware that it says, or if the buyer does not have loan approval within and by expiration of loan approval period, but buyer is satisfied with his ability to obtain loan approval and wants to proceed, buyer can deliver that notice to the seller. And as long as he does so prior to expiration of loan approval period, he can continue with the contract with the protections of paragraph 8. So that's new. So here's an example of how that could play out. You know how I was just telling you that a buyer who gets a loan approval, which has a condition that the property has to appraise, at least in the amount of the loan, and that we have established is not loan approval because loan approval is two components, getting approved for the loan and making sure that the lender has already received the satisfactory appraisal. So that would not constitute loan approval, okay? But under this second portion of 8BII, the buyer who is unable to obtain loan approval because the appraisal hasn't been finalized here, He can still say, I'm satisfied with my ability to obtain loan approval, and he can proceed to close. So that's how that would work out. Significant change, by the way. Moving on to paragraph 8B IV or 8B4, this is the clause that you were familiar with that said if the buyer was unable to obtain a loan approval, as long as he terminated the contract within loan approval period, he would simply receive a reimbursement of his deposit and go about his change. That is the same. But what is new, and I'm going to read it to you, it's on lines 115 through 119, is if buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within loan approval period, or, this is new, or cannot timely meet the terms of the loan approval, all after exercise of good faith and diligent effort, buyer may terminate the contract by delivering written notice. So that concept, in my mind, we've never had that language in the contract, so to that extent, it's new. But anytime a buyer got a loan approval that, in good faith and due diligence, he couldn't live up to, if he said he got loan approval, he was going to lose his deposit. So this change makes sense to me, allowing a buyer to look at what the bank has given him. Now, the buyer, it's not discretionary with the buyer to determine, oh, I got loan approval, but I can't live up to it, because it says he cannot timely meet the terms of the loan approval, and he must exercise good faith and diligent effort, okay? So it's not discretionary, but it's if he can't actually do it by using good faith and diligent effort, he can terminate the contract. Otherwise, if we didn't allow this, to be honest with you, all buyers would lose their deposits based upon, some conditions in a loan that a buyer couldn't, in good faith, live up to. That moves us forward to paragraph 8B5 or 8BB. This is the clause which exists now but has been expanded upon. So if right now, let me just read it and then we'll talk about it. If buyer fails to timely deliver any written notice provided for in paragraph 8B3 or 4 to seller prior to expiration of loan approval period, then buyer shall proceed forward with the contract as if paragraph 8A was checked. So let's go back. What this clause says is if the buyer stays silent and doesn't say, I got my loan approval or I didn't get my loan approval, this is going to automatically convert this contract into a cash transaction. That is new, that is significant, that is a different approach, and I want you to mark it, okay? That's different. And here's sort of the rationale here. The current contract, the one that's online now, allowed for buyer silence to equal that he was deemed to have loan approval. Okay, so that concept has now gone away. Now, the one thing I didn't mention is that what is the same is that if a buyer stays silent, the seller still has 3 days after the expiration of loan approval period to terminate. But if he doesn't, that's when it turns into a cash transaction. Very good. Okay. Now, take a deep breath because we're almost at the end of paragraph 8. And this, by the way, is the paragraph that contains the most changes. So once we get done with this one, we are going to be moving a little bit quicker from paragraph to paragraph. This paragraph kind of emulates the paragraph that exists now as 8B VII, 8B7, okay? So think about the last paragraph that contained in 8B that you all call about all the time. So first I want to talk about what the contract says now and how the changes are impacting it. Okay, so right now the contract says if the buyer obtained a loan or was deemed to have obtained a loan, that is he stayed silent, so he was deemed to have obtained a loan, but does not close due to failure to fund, it says the seller will get the deposit unless the seller has defaulted. There are property-related conditions of the loan that can't be met, or the appraisal is insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval, okay? And it's this last part that is now gone, okay? It's gone because we are no longer going to be seeing appraisals coming in at the last minute. The appraisal is now part of loan approval and must be obtained within loan approval period. So that language, that parentheses 3, that allowed a buyer to terminate at closing if he had gotten a loan or was deemed to have gotten a loan, is gone, because appraisal issues are not going to be taken up at the back end. They're going to be taken up at the front end during loan approval period. Okay. So now, that having been said, let me go back to what 8B VI now says. It no longer says if buyer obtained a loan approval or was deemed to have obtained a loan approval. That's gone. Now it simply says, this is lines 126 through 127 and 129. If the buyer sends notice that he got loan approval, or he sends the notice that he did not get loan approval, but he's confident that he can get loan approval and plans to proceed to close, but there is a failure to fund, the seller's going to get the deposit unless it's the seller's default, that remains the same, or 2, the property-related conditions haven't been met of the loan, okay? So that is the same, with the exception of the fact that there's been a carve-out and a clarification that an appraisal is not a property-related condition, okay? Again, all of this regarding appraisals is simply to expedite the lender's receipt of the appraisal and to iron out problems with appraisals at the front end rather than the back end. All right, yay, we got through paragraph 8. Okay, this moves us forward to paragraph 9. Next change I want to highlight is on line 141, and it pertains to cost to be paid by the seller. There's a new cost in that column, and it is charges for FERPTA withholding and reporting. Why was it put on the seller side? Because when FERPTA only applies when you have a foreign seller. Next change, paragraph 9C III. This is the Miami-Dade Broward Regional Provision. Okay, so those of you all in South Florida are very familiar with this and know we from time to time got calls from you guys about the fact that that clause did not specify who selected the closing agent. The committee decided to close that loop and now has started the paragraph by saying buyer shall designate closing agent. That having been said, that is not a wildly significant change in my mind. It's simply a clarification because the buyer under this provision is paying for the title policy premium anyway. Another change in paragraph 9 has to do with the time frame for obtaining a survey. The change is that the survey is to be performed at least 5 days prior to closing, rather than being tied to the delivery of title evidence. And why was this done? It actually, the contract used to say this years ago, and it turns out that that's a better fit and preferable for closing agents and surveyors. It gets surveyors, it gives them more time, and it gives the closing agent, an opportunity to give the title commitment to the surveyor who might use it in his work. That takes us to paragraph 9F, special assessments. Okay, so the portion I want you to look at is line 196 through 198, and it has to do with the payment of special assessments and the negotiations between the parties when the assessments may be paid in installments. Okay, so I want you to focus simply on the second box, box B. That clause has been altered. This clause was the box you would check if the seller was to pay the assessment in full prior to or at the time of closing. Well, as it turns out, and we heard from an attorney in a couple of attorneys in various parts of the state, there are some special assessments that are due in installments where the collecting authority doesn't allow you to prepay them. So as a result, the new language has been added. So now that if you check off box B, it says seller shall pay in full prior to or at time of closing any assessment allowed by the public body to be prepaid, okay? But for an assessment which a public body does not allow prepayment, you're going to assume option A has been checked for those assessments. And again, it has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that some cannot be paid off early. Second change to paragraph 9F involves special assessments by special districts, okay? Those used to be negotiated assessments between the parties. There has now been a change made. So special assessments imposed by a special district pursuant to Chapter 189 will no longer be negotiated in the contract, but will be treated like CDDs as a prorated item. Paragraph 11, the property maintenance. This is point of clarification only. As you know, paragraph 11 requires the seller to maintain a property as it is on the date the contract becomes effective, except for ordinary wear and tear. Sometimes sellers are not able to do this. And in anticipation of that, paragraph 9A has escrow procedures set up for that matter, all right? The only thing that changed here was that now the committee is referring the parties to paragraph 9A for escrow procedures if it's applicable, and that is contained on line 259. Okay, this brings us to paragraph 18, standard F, time. We've got a couple of calls on this, and so I want to talk about it with you. And first of all, I need to tell you all, we get calls on calculating time all the time. So all the time. But if you could look at lines 432 and 436 through 438, and I'm going to kind of explain it to you. So this contract uses calendar days to calculate time. What is new here is that second sentence that reads now, calendar days based on where the property is located shall be used in computing time periods. This change was made for the following reasons. How do you calculate a calendar day? Today began at 12 midnight last night, and this calendar day goes all the way until 11:59 p.m. tonight. That's a calendar day. With that in mind, coupled with the fact that we have parties now from all over the world that own property here and are selling them as sellers and are buying these properties. So the committee wanted to clarify that when you are calculating time, the calendar day is not set by where the buyer or seller is located. In fact, the calendar day is calculated by the time zone where the property is located. So by way of example, tonight at 11:59, this day ends. But if I were in California, it actually wouldn't end for another 3 hours because Pacific Standard Time is 3 hours back. So it really doesn't matter what's in California if we're dealing with time calculations for a Florida property with this contract. So that explains the first change. The second change has to do with when a time period or date ends or occurs on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday. We have been inundated with calls when we have a holiday that occurs on a Saturday or a Sunday, but is observed either the preceding Friday or the following Monday. Okay, so in an effort to clarify, you'll see the red line language, which is contained on line 436 through 438. And now we're going to come back to it, but first I just kind of want to show you an example. Let's assume, and I think it's this year, for purposes of this year, December 25th occurs on a Sunday. Now, December 25th, which of course is Christmas Day, is a national holiday. But because it occurs on a Sunday, banks, Federal Reserve, most offices are closed on the 26th, the Monday, all right? So if you had a contract that said the closing was to occur on December 26th, that would actually be not the date of the national holiday, but the date on which the national holiday was observed. So this was the point of this change. I'm going to go back to it now and just read it over for you. Essentially, well, it's a long sentence, but I'm going to read it just hopefully so it will gel in your mind. So other than time for acceptance and effective date, as set forth in paragraph 3, any time periods provided for or dates specified in this contract, whether handwritten, pre-printed, typewritten, or inserted herein, well, which shall occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday, or, this is the new part, or a day on which a national legal public holiday is observed because it fell on a Saturday or Sunday, shall extend to the next calendar day, which is not a Saturday, Sunday, or a day on which a national legal public holiday is observed. So the last point to pick up from that is the current contract, the old contract said you were to extend to the next day up until 5 o'clock, 5 p.m. that day. This one, the 5 p.m. has now been taken away. So when you have a time period or date that ends on a Saturday, Sunday, national legal holiday, or a day on which a national legal holiday is observed, the parties have the entire next calendar day to perform. And that was simply as an effort to make everything consistent in terms of, you don't have, it's harder to remember what dates have to be cut off at 5 p.m. and what dates don't. So that was why that was done. This brings us to standard G, force majeure. And, I have to say that this paragraph was worked on by a number of attorneys on the committee. It took quite a while, and it was changed quite a bit. And I would mark this as a significant change, okay? I kind of broken it up into bits. One thing that has been changed about the force majeure clause is that it's been expanded. Currently, the clause provides that a buyer or seller who cannot perform an obligation under the contract or cannot close due to the unavailability of services is entitled to an extension because of a force majeure. What's been added is, in addition to parties not being able to perform their obligations, they are given now more time if they can't perform their rights. And this is on lines 439 through 440 and 442. And the best way I can explain it maybe is just to give you a simple example. An example of a party being required to perform an obligation would be a buyer has to make the deposit by the date certain set forth in the contract. That is the buyer's obligation. An example of a right that might be interfered with by a force majeure would be, say, a buyer who wants to perform a walkthrough inspection. The buyer has the right to do that inspection, but he doesn't have the obligation. And frankly, this came up when you all called, left, right, and center at the beginning of the pandemic when people couldn't get out of the states they were living in because of, all kinds of COVID restrictions and access property to do inspections. And so it came up that the force majeure clause really could be expanded to allow parties additional time, not only to perform their obligations, but their rights as well. Second part of the change regarding force majeure includes what events are defined as force majeure events. And I've got them highlighted in red, what has been added. And what has been added is civil unrest or government actions and mandates, government shutdowns, epidemics, and pandemics. So again, what is included within the definition of force majeure is broader than it was now under the new revision. The last change that I wanted to bring to you all regarding force majeure deals with lines 446 through 447, which talks about when the force majeure event begins. So, and the best example I can give you is that we all know, being that we live here in Florida, that a hurricane can interfere with a party's ability to perform its obligations or its rights even before the hurricane has landed, because we know, we can't get inspectors out to properties when everybody's running around trying to buy water and close up, window openings and things like that. So now, under the contract, it specifies that the force majeure event will be deemed to have begun on the first day the effect of the force majeure prevents performance, non-performance, or the availability of insurance services or other required approvals essential to close. This wraps us now to paragraph 18, standard K. This change in standard K dovetails to what we talked about in paragraph 9F with regard to special assessments by special districts. So now when you look at paragraph K, you will see, standard K, you will see that in addition to prorating assessments under a CDD, in addition, you will see assessments will be prorated for any special assessments imposed by a special district. Okay, ding, ding, ding. I'm at it again. This is paragraph 18, standard O. I am concerned that you all mark this one, that this is a change, okay? Normally, you probably don't spend a lot of time looking at standard O, but I want you to, for our purposes of discussion today. Standard O covers a number of things, but for our purposes today, what I wanted you to be aware of was the method of delivering notices has changed. Now, it may or may not impact you. It just depends on how you were delivering notice. And many things under the contract require delivery, like if you're dealing with an as-is contract, during the inspection period, if the buyer is unhappy with, how the property was viewed by the inspector, the buyer might want to terminate, and the contract requires the notice of cancellation to be delivered within the inspection period in order to terminate. So if we were dealing with that kind of a matter, we have to be sure that the notice to the seller is provided timely and in accordance with in accordance with standard O. So right now, the change is that acceptable delivery methods will now be mail, fax, personal delivery, or email. What's different, and if you'll look on line 532 at the top of my, in my red line on this screen, what has been deleted is delivery by electronic media. And so my point to you is this: electronic media is out, email is fine, facsimile is fine. But if you are delivering notice through a text or social media posts or other electronic means that do not include fax or email, you need to change, or because now the contract simply has narrowed that field. That brings us to paragraph 19, addenda and additional terms. What I wanted to call your attention to is the third column of riders. There are now 2 new riders on this list, and that's seasonal or vacation rentals, rider DD, and rider E, pace disclosure. we're going to talk about that in a minute. Moving on, the last page of the contract, I think it's line 610, now has the counteroffer language. It has been simplified from what it was in the previous contract. But in addition, I wanted to call to your attention that that box that used to be there where the seller could check that he rejected the offer has been removed. And we have heard some comments from you guys about that. The comments have been, you know, well, we're not sure. We wanted it removed because we do, when we're representing buyers, we do like the seller to mark that so we can give the rejection to the buyer so he knows the offer was presented. And while I understand what you're saying, you certainly can still ask for it, and you can ask the listing agent to mark it as rejected. The box was removed, and the rationale behind that was the sellers don't have to sign that they reject. And many of them wouldn't, and especially when there were so many offers that the seller had in hand, you know, having him check off that he rejected 20 offers was just a bridge too far. So for that reason, because you can't mandate a seller do this, the box was removed. Now, what we just did was review all of the changes that I considered significant on the as-is contract. All of those changes, every one of them, is also are contained in the standard residential contract for sale and purchase. But in addition to those changes, there are 3 other changes, and I thought I just would highlight them for you. If you happen to have the residential contract for sale and purchase, the black lines, you know, without the red lines, additions and subtractions, on line 292 and 293, you'll see an addition. And this is contained in paragraph 12. Paragraph 12, of course, is the inspection provision. And if you're dealing with the standard residential contract, there are specific items that a buyer is allowed to inspect and that the seller has represented are in working condition. And there's something that's been added here. And what's been added, if you're dealing probably only with some kind of waterfront property, is watercraft lifts and related equipment. That was not in the previous version. It is now in the standard residential contract. But you see, because we're dealing with inspections and specific items, it's not contained in the as-is, because in the as-is, the buyer can look at anything. Same is true with the second edition. It's also it resides in paragraph 12. It's 12B III, and the change is if you're using the standard contract, the seller, if he's in receipt of the list of items that buyer asks that be repaired, the seller can go ahead and make those repairs without having to get estimates first if the seller so desires. And then lastly, it's at the bottom of the screen. What else is different is paragraph 19. There is one new rider that's been added to the standard residential contract for sale and purchase, and that is rider I. That was a place on the current form that was reserved. There was nothing there. So the committee used that place, and now rider I is the mold inspection. And why was this done? It was done because if you're using the regular standard residential contract, paragraph 12 did not include an inspection for mold. So there was a request that this be added, and so it was. So again, and I will talk about this shortly. Okay. This leads me to, and Joanna, I'm looking at you, but I think we've got 20 more minutes. Is that about right? Okay, so I'm going to keep going, and if there is any time left, I will lob it to you. But right now, I'm going to review with everybody, starting with the new riders. So again, 3 brand new riders: mold addendum, seasonal and vacation rentals after close, and rider EE, property assessed clean energy, the PACE disclosure rider. So let's start with those. This is what the new rider I mold inspection looks like. And for those of you who use the standard residential contract or add a mold rider to your forms, that is in the Form Simplicity Library. It's the Florida Realtor form. This rider was sort of modeled after that. So I'm thinking that you are going to be accustomed to the language contained in the form. Essentially, a buyer who's buying the property not on the as-is contract, but with the standard residential contract, who wants to inspect for mold, does not want to buy a property in the event there's mold or mold damage found, which exceeds, a cap he inserts in the rider, can use this new rider I. It does require that the buyer use a professional to inspect for mold. It does require that the mold inspection be performed within a stated period of time, which is the mold inspection period, which will be 20 days as the default date if no blank is filled in. It does require that the buyer deliver to the seller within mold inspection period a copy of the report if mold or mold damage is found. It does allow for the buyer to cancel the contract in the event the cost to remediate the mold or to repair the damage exceeds the cap, but in the event the buyer does not timely conduct the inspection and does not fail to terminate timely, the contingency is waived. So again, it's very similar to the one you might have been using all along. In addition, I want to talk a little bit about the new rider DD, seasonal and vacation rentals after closing. It's a brand new rider. It is to be used if you've got a seller who might be unsure that the property is going to close and he's afraid that he doesn't want to miss taking rentals for the season, or he doesn't want to pass up on vacation rental options. He can use this. And what this rider does is allow the two parties, the buyer and the seller, to negotiate whether the seller has authority to enter into new seasonal or short-term vacation rental agreements. And if you check off the seller may, those agreements need to be at market rate and term. Again, if the parties have determined that the seller can continue to lease this property out where the occupancy is after closing, then there's a set of boxes for the parties to negotiate whether the buyer has to agree to the terms prior to the seller entering into them, or whether the seller can do it without the buyer's agreement, and a provision that the seller will, at or before closing, give copies of the agreements to the buyer, because the property, again, this is about the property being occupied after closing. The second portion of Rider B deals with seasonal rentals if there was a property management agreement in place. So if there was a property management agreement in place for seasonal rentals, this clause specifies that the seller has to provide a copy of the management agreement to the buyer within 5 days of effective date, and that the buyer has 5 days to review it. If the buyer is not happy with this property management agreement, it does not want to be bound to it, the buyer should terminate the agreement. If the buyer is happy, then the buyer can agree to be bound to the terms of that property management agreement. Okay. This takes us to Rider EE, which is the PACE disclosure. You all have probably been using the Florida Realtor PACE disclosure if, in fact, you were involved in sales of property representing the seller if there was PACE financing on the property. Because this rider is supposed to be used if there's an assessment levied on the property being purchased where there is PACE financing on the property with an unpaid balance. So the purpose is the same for this form as with the other Florida Realtors form. And the statutory language, I'm going to go back to it, is the same. So you see the last paragraph of this rider says statutory disclosure, and this is what the seller must disclose to a buyer when he's selling a property with an existing PACE loan on it. What is different, though, about this rider versus the other form you may have been accustomed to is the second paragraph, and I just want to read it. The second paragraph says, in the event buyer is obtaining a mortgage loan to purchase the property, be advised that most mortgage lenders will require the satisfaction or release of the PACE financing from the property. So this is sort of a, hey, seller, if you're selling a property with the PACE lien, you're going to have to pay that off if the buyer is obtaining financing to buy the property. It's also a tell to the buyer because he needs to know that if he's going to go out and try to get financing, if there's a PACE loan on the property, it most likely won't happen unless the seller pays this off. So that is the one difference between essentially this form and the one that you might be accustomed to using. That brings us to Rider B, which is the HOA disclosure, association disclosure. There were just a couple of minor things done to it. I thought I would highlight them for you. Check box. Now, you know that rider is 2 pages. The first page is basically the statutory disclosure. There have been no changes to that. The second page, which has some more detailed information, was tweaked very slightly. Paragraph 1, there's been language added that the association, to indicate whether the association has to approve the buyer or not, so that's new. In addition, in paragraph 2, payment of fees, assessments, and other association charges, there was additional language added to clarify that if a special assessment came up after effective date and before closing, and if it was payable in full by the seller, that would be the seller's obligation. And then lastly, in paragraph C of that clause, this language actually came from the condominium rider and specifies seller shall pay prior to or at closing all fines imposed against the seller or the property by the association which exists as of the closing date, and the fees the association charges to provide information about the property assessments and fees. So again, this language, the committee realized it really should have been in the HOA rider, that it wasn't, and placed it from the condominium rider into this rider as well. Speaking of which, I did want to mention to you all that the committee worked on some changes to the condominium rider, and that's a rider that's used, very often during transactions in Florida. But the committee decided to put a pause on any changes, and that is because at the time they were considering the changes, the Surfside tragedy occurred. And with the Surfside tragedy, the thought on the committee's part was that we may be seeing a number of changes statutorily. So we thought rather than to make some incremental changes and then change it again, we were going to wait to determine, if anything does flush out in terms of rules or statutes, and then make the changes all at once. Lastly, I wanted just to touch on Rider E, which is the FHA VA rider. The couple of changes really came from you all. I'm going to share this, and then I'll kind of show you where in the form the changes were. I can't tell you how many of you over the last couple of years have called us to tell us that VA no longer requires the seller to pay the WDO inspection, but the rider said that. And the rider said that because at the time it was created, that was a requirement of the VA. And then again, called us to say that's no longer, required. So under that idea, the committee decided to eliminate specifying what charges the seller had to pay in light of the fact that this could be a changing landscape. So if you were to look at the FHA VA rider, and I'm looking at paragraph 4 at the moment, you will see with regard to VA financing, we no longer specify which inspections and fees have to be paid by the seller. The contract simply says seller shall pay all required fees under VA regulations. And in addition to that, what is new is now there is an amount you can insert which can cap what the seller will have to pay and a default of that amount of $250 if that is not paid. Same idea in paragraph 2 with regard to FHA. We tried to make the language more generic in case the regulations changed so that now the seller is to comply with all lender required inspections and appraisal repairs rather than to naming them specifically for that very reason. And lastly, there's a change in paragraph 3 regarding FHA. And the change is there was a default cap of $100 put in for a tax service fee. So I think I'm wrapped up. I will say there are a couple of other riders that have some small changes as well as the contracts, but we thought that you all could digest those probably on their own because we know you have a cap in the amount that we can really, take in at one time. So we went, I'm trying to see, did we go an hour and a half? Or do we have time for questions, Joanna? Let me know.
So thank you, Marcia. Wow. This has been one of the most, in my humble opinion, and I didn't teach it, so I'm going to say this. To me, I think one of the most useful sessions that we've been able to offer you. This is the most well-attended Zoom we've had here at Florida Realtors, and I think it is the result of the fact that this contract is one of the most useful tools that you have in your business. And so the chat was on fire. So thank you all for that. We are almost out of time. Let me tell you how this is kind of going to go, and give you a little bit of the roadmap moving forward. Listen, you may have heard Marcia say several times during her presentation, we receive questions about, or over the years, we've received phone calls about. You've heard me say that you all are like our intelligence officers in the field, giving us intel on the industry. This PowerPoint presentation, the changes themselves are in many instances a direct result of calls we've gotten into the hotline, and then called or emails into the forms mailbox. The presentation today, those of you who took the time to give us questions in your registration packet. I have tons of questions or topics that I've written down. I'll have the whole chat, don't get me wrong, but I'm excited about process questions like what happens if I get a Form 5, on November 2nd, or I have a contract for a Form 5, but I get an addendum for a Form 6. I mean, just some incredible questions that I'm excited about forming some resources on. So rather than try to go through questions now, let me give you all some wrap-up instructions. This presentation and the corresponding PowerPoint with some edits that your keen eyes found for us today, thank you, will be posted on the Florida Realtors webpage as soon as we can get those up for you. Please use those. Use those for your association trainings. Use those for your office trainings. We will be scheduling as soon as we possibly can a financing section specific hour or so, and we will make sure we leave plenty of time for questions there. When you register for that, we will have the questions that you have today, lots of questions on financing, but we will appreciate any specific questions that you can give us when you register for that financing meeting, because we will incorporate those into our PowerPoint on that financing section and get as many of those answered. Now that you have the information and have digested it, we can be very specific in that presentation. Then after that, we anticipate either a Take 5 video or something with the rest of these questions that we have received today and those that we will subsequently receive. So your feedback is valuable here. The final deployment date for this contract, the new contract, will be November 1st. So all of the resources will be out there and ready for you prior to that, well in advance of that, so that you can educate yourselves, your associations, your offices on these changes. So just really quickly, thank you for joining us today, but I want to thank our Florida Realtors leadership team again for giving us the resources that we need to be able to bring these things to you. I want to thank Heather Rhodes in particular, who's not with us today from my office, but who helped put this all together, and the other attorneys at Florida Realtors for debating this endlessly to get you to where we are today. I want to thank the Realtor Attorney Committee, our chair and the vice chair, and all that they do, the countless hours working on this, the Florida Bar, the Florida Realtors Forum Simplicity and Technology team, the communications team, the meeting services team. But most of all, I want to thank you for your valuable input, comments, questions, and the time that you took to join us here today. We hope that this will allow you to be successful and close some transactions. Join us for our next webinar on the financing section, time to be announced, but track the Florida Realtors news. The announcement should come out fairly soon. You all have a wonderful Friday and a fantastic weekend. If you do have specific questions today, please give us a call on the Florida Realtors legal hotline, 407-438-1409. Bye-bye.